In the history of the United States, few figures remain as complex and debated as Robert E. Lee. To some, he is remembered as a brilliant military strategist. To others, he represents a painful chapter of American history. But beyond opinions, one fact remains undeniable: Robert E. Lee rose to command one of the most powerful armies of his time, and ended his life watching everything he once stood for collapse. So how did this happen? How did a respected officer of the United States Army become the leading general of the Confederate States? And how did a man known for discipline and tactical brilliance ultimately lose everything? To understand this, we must go back before the war began. Compass early life and military foundation. Robert Edward Lee was born in 1807 in Virginia, into a family with strong military and political connections. His father, Henry Lighthorse Harry Lee, had been a hero of the American Revolutionary War, but despite that legacy, the family later faced financial hardship. This shaped Robert E. Lee's personality early in life. He grew up disciplined, reserved, and deeply committed to duty and structure. In 1825, he entered the United States Military Academy at West Point. At West Point, Lee distinguished himself not through rebellion or aggression, but through precision. He graduated near the top of his class, and completed his studies without receiving a single disciplinary demerit, an achievement that reflected his strict self-control. After graduation, Lee joined the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers. For years, he worked on military engineering projects, building fortifications and studying terrain, skills that would later define his battlefield strategy. Crossword's early military career and reputation. Before the Civil War, Robert E. Lee served for decades in the United States Army. One of his most notable assignments came during the Mexican-American War in the 1840s. During that conflict, he served under General Winfield Scott. Lee's role as an engineer and reconnaissance officer earned him strong recognition. He became known for his ability to analyze terrain quickly, identify enemy weaknesses, and support battlefield planning with precision. By the time the war ended, Lee had earned a reputation as one of the most capable officers in the U.S. Army. But despite his success, he was never politically ambitious. He was not a man seeking power. He was a man who believed in duty, and that belief would soon place him in an impossible position. United States, a nation dividing. By the 1850s, the United States was becoming increasingly divided. The central issue was slavery, but the conflict went far beyond that. The North was industrializing rapidly and moving toward abolitionist policies. The South relied heavily on agriculture and enslaved labor. Tensions escalated year after year until the nation reached a breaking point. In private correspondence, Lee expressed moral discomfort with slavery. However, he also believed deeply in one principle that would define his decision: his loyalty to his home state of Virginia. In 1861, everything changed when Virginia voted to secede from the Union and join the Confederacy. Robert E. Lee faced a decision that would define American history. President Abraham Lincoln had even considered Lee for command of the Union Army, but Lee ultimately made his choice. He resigned from the U.S. Army and joined the Confederate States of America. Crosswords. The Civil War begins. The American Civil War began in 1861 and quickly escalated into one of the most destructive conflicts in American history. Robert E. Lee was soon appointed commander of the Army of Northern Virginia. From the beginning, Lee faced a major disadvantage. The Confederacy had fewer resources, fewer soldiers, and less industrial power than the Union. Yet despite these limitations, Lee demonstrated remarkable tactical ability. He understood something critical about warfare. A smaller army could still win battles through speed, surprise, and psychological pressure. Under his command, the Confederate Army achieved several early successes. But success in war is never permanent. Rise of a military strategist. Between 1862 and 1863, Lee's reputation as a military genius grew rapidly. He executed bold strategies against larger Union forces. One of his defining characteristics was offensive momentum. Instead of waiting defensively, Lee often chose to strike first. This approach created uncertainty within Union leadership. However, every victory came at a cost. The Confederate Army could not replace losses as easily as the Union could. Still, Lee pressed forward. He believed that decisive victories could shift political pressure in favor of the Confederacy. This belief led to one of the most important campaigns of the war. Crossroads, the Maryland Campaign, and Antietam. In 1862, Lee led his army north into Union territory for the first time. This invasion culminated in the Battle of Antietam. Antietam became one of the bloodiest single-day battles in American history. Although tactically inconclusive, it had major strategic consequences. It ended Lee's first invasion of the North, and it gave the Union a critical opportunity to change the direction of the war. Following Antietam, President Abraham Lincoln issued the preliminary Emancipation Proclamation, changing the moral and political nature of the conflict. From that point forward, the war was no longer only about Union or division. It became a war about slavery as well. Fredericksburg and Chancellorsville. Despite increasing pressure, Lee continued to demonstrate battlefield effectiveness. At Fredericksburg in late 1862, Confederate forces achieved a decisive defensive victory against Union assaults. Then in 1863 came Chancellorsville. At Chancellorsville, Lee made one of his most famous tactical decisions. He divided his already smaller army in the face of a larger opponent, a highly risky maneuver. The result was a Confederate victory. However, the victory came at a devastating cost. General Stonewall Jackson, one of Lee's most trusted commanders, was accidentally mortally wounded by friendly fire during the battle. His loss was a major blow to the Confederate command structure. Even as Lee succeeded on the battlefield, the war was beginning to take a heavier toll on his army. Gettysburg, the turning point. In 1863, Lee made another major decision. He launched a second invasion of the North, leading his army into Pennsylvania. This campaign resulted in the Battle of Gettysburg. Gettysburg lasted 3 days and became the largest battle ever fought in North America. Lee's army faced the Union Army of the Potomac under General George G. Meade. The battle ended in Confederate defeat. The failed assault, known as Pickett's Charge, marked a turning point in the war. From that moment forward, the Confederate army began to lose its strategic momentum. Lee's army retreated back to Virginia. Although he remained a respected commander, the balance of power was shifting permanently. Crossroads, Grant takes command. In 1864, Union General Ulysses S. Grant was appointed commander of all Union armies. Grant adopted a different strategy. Instead of retreating after losses, he applied constant pressure on Confederate forces. This campaign, known as the Overland Campaign, pushed Lee's army into continuous defensive battles. The war entered a new phase of relentless attrition. Lee's forces were gradually worn down. Supplies became limited, manpower decreased, and the Confederacy's ability to continue the war weakened significantly. Derelict house, the fall of Richmond. By 1865, the Confederate capital of Richmond was no longer defensible. Union forces captured the city, marking a symbolic and strategic collapse of the Confederacy. Lee's army retreated west in an attempt to regroup, but it was clear that the situation was no longer sustainable. Balanced scale, Appomattox and surrender. On April 9, 1865, Robert E. Lee met Ulysses South Grant at Appomattox Courthouse in Virginia. There, he surrendered the Army of Northern Virginia. Grant's surrender terms were notably generous. Confederate soldiers were allowed to return home, keeping their horses for farming and personal use. This moment effectively marked the end of the Civil War. For Lee, it was the end of a long military career, and the collapse of the cause he had once chosen to serve. Compass after the war. After the war, Robert E. Lee did not return to public military life. Instead, he became president of Washington College in Virginia, working in education and supporting reconciliation efforts. He encouraged former Confederates to accept the outcome of the war and rebuild society. Lee died in 1870 after suffering a stroke. Balanced scale, conclusion. Why he lost everything. Robert E. Lee did not lose the Civil War because of a lack of intelligence. Historically, he is still regarded as one of the most capable military tacticians of his era. However, several structural realities determined the outcome. The Union had significantly greater industrial power, larger population and military manpower, better supply networks, and the ability to sustain long-term warfare. Lee's strategy relied on winning decisive battles quickly, but the war evolved into a long war of attrition, something the Confederacy could not sustain. In the end, Lee's defeat was not simply the failure of one man. It was the outcome of unequal systems, resources, and time. And that is why Robert E. Lee, despite his brilliance, ultimately lost everything in the Civil War.